This discussion will deconstruct the process of reading for us. We will probably be able to understand how reading as a source of comprehension is not taken for granted and is actually an outcome or interaction of few factors coming together. Not coming between this valuable insight and you, I welcome Kamala and Mr. Colin.
So welcome everyone. Is this on? Yeah. And also you can probably hear, you're close enough, up close and personal. So what we want to tell you about today, one of the topics is to explain to you why psychologists say that reading is an unnatural act. Why would they say that? It's unnatural. The reason for this has to do with evolution. You know that this brain and body evolves over a very long time scale. And if you think of us several millennia ago wandering around the African savanna, we were looking for food, water. We were not looking for the nearest library. Sujata, are you here? Sorry. We weren't. And this is the same brain and body that we still have, more or less. So in a very real sense, our brains were not wired for reading, in the sense that they are wired for many other things that we do. For instance, our brains are wired for recognizing and differentiating faces very keenly. They're wired for learning and speaking language without any explicit instruction, and several other things. But we're not wired for reading. So then how is it that human beings read? All of us read. How have we accomplished this? So this story is kind of interesting. That's a sketch of one side of the brain, the side view. Face is on my side. Okay, and now there are parts of the brain that are responsible for very specific things. We have brains that do things in modules. Okay, so something called face recognition and object recognition take place somewhere here, somewhere that like A, B, those areas. Now, in people who have not yet learned to read and write, or who are in that word illiterate, those areas are responsible for recognizing objects. But once we start learning to read, a part of that object recognition gets hijacked. It's called hijacked for reading. Because if you think about it, a letter is an object that has to be recognized, and so is a word. Okay, so that area, that B area over there, it's called the visual word form area. And whenever we read, that's the part of the brain that's matching what we see with what it's got stored in it. And it's amazing. It can read upside down letters, backwards words, mixed case, cursive, print. It can do all that. And of course, the story after that gets only more complicated, the reading story, because after we see a word, it then moves to the front of the brain for us to understand what that word means. And parallelly, but slower, it also moves to the auditory part so that we silently say the word that we're reading. So it's like a race. Which reaches first? The one that immediately recognizes the word, or the root that speaks it out and then remembers it from language, from spoken language. Okay, now why we're sharing all this is, I don't know if you have heard of this author called Marianne Wolf. She's a psychologist who's written very passionately about the reading brain. And what she says is, look, we've taken so long, centuries, to perfect the teaching of reading. We've invented reading and writing and reading, and we've taken all this time to perfect the art of reading and how to teach it. And we're also only now beginning to make sure that everybody gets literacy. And already there's this big threat. This is her feeling. There's this huge threat in the form of the digital media, of course, that's going to come in the way, and maybe we will lose this. This is, of course, her view. I'd urge you to read her books. One is called Proust and the Squid. So, Colin, you want to take over now?
Yeah, I want to approach it slightly differently in terms of someone else that I've been working with and whose works I've been looking at, and that's the psychologist Daniel Willingham. And he has something interesting, beyond reading now, into something called reading comprehension. And you see, we first decode. You'll hear primary years teachers talk a lot about decoding, which is essentially recognizing the letters. And then, once you recognize the letters, you're able to string them together and form a word and understand it. But what do you do next? How do you string those together into meaningful chunks and understand what's on the page? And that we'd like to call comprehension. So decoding after a point becomes automatic, but reading comprehension becomes slightly more complicated because it's not just the letters. There's one more thing, one more factor that's really important. And that is, interestingly, it's the world around us. In order to be able to understand what's going on the page, I must have some knowledge of the world. And this is where perhaps beyond a point, reading comprehension strategies don't help. I really need to know and see what a tree is. And no one, if I haven't seen a tree before, I'm not going to be able, with whatever reading strategy, to help me read that about the tree. There's one more interesting fact besides the knowledge of the world, and that is as we read more and more, we develop knowledge of those texts. You see, it has to go in the form of something. When people write for us to read, it goes in the form of something. It might be a novel, might be a report, might be a newspaper article. You see, each of these are text types. And the more we read, the more acquainted we get with the conventions of those text types. You see, each text type has a slightly different set of conventions. One is more formal than the other, one has a different structure. So it's both the knowledge of the world and the conventions of these text types and the printed matter on the page. There's a very interesting three-way relationship that goes into making something understandable, that goes into reading comprehension. And to give you a demonstration, I've got something really, really short here and small. It's a poem by Carlos William. They're just opening out that. It's a little Word document I've got. That's it. It's just 3 stanzas, if you want to call them stanzas. And I'll read it out. This is just to say, I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so cold. Deliberately chose a simple one, and I want to invite you at this stage, very quickly, although we have questions at the end as well. What did you see? Did you notice any patterns in there? Does anyone notice any patterns? I'm not even asking for meaning. I'll step out of your way. Yes, very good. But you can see you are working with it. Yes. Do you see images? Yes, it's chunked that way. Excellent. And images, anyone?
I could see the images instantly. I
Yeah.
could see the image of a person looking very regretfully at an icebox and picking his plums with all.
Yeah.
And I see somebody with plum juice running down their chin.
Yeah. And of course, one actually sees the plums too. And now, another level I want to ask about. What about senses? Which senses do you think you had to actually, sympathize with? Which senses did you have to recall to understand this? Yes? Yes? Temperature, yeah, the taste, the sense of touch, temperature, all of those come through, and you can see these layers. And this is not even, we're not even asking, as you heard in the morning at the panel, we're not even asking, have you understood this poem? Right? You can see that there's an experience of the poem that is a little more than just understanding it in the mind, as people like to say, intellectually. And I think Kamala has something to say about that.
Yeah, I wanted to share that actually all of us have two readers in the brain, not one, but two. See, if I say a sentence like this, suppose you were to read, she takes the bread out of her mouth to give it to her kids. Okay? I don't know if you've heard this kind of thing. So there are actually two of you in here understanding. One of them has got this literal meaning of what I just said, and the other has the figurative meaning, the connotative meaning. Like what is the deeper meaning possibly, right? And we all have these two modes in the brain. The brain has two modes of reading and understanding. One of them that understands literal meaning, and the other that gets the figurative. It's also the one that gets the jokes, often. And these two readers are roughly mapped onto the right and left hemispheres of the brain. Plenty of research shows that we all have both. It's not the case that some people are left brain readers and some are right brain. Some of us are creative and some are literal. No, we all have both. That's one message I want to give very clearly. And the research is very fascinating. It shows, for example, that if I say dish, and I ask you, what's the most obvious word you can say in response to dish? What? Sorry, I didn't hear. Food, okay. That's probably your left hemisphere responding. And if I say, can you come up with an unusual association word for dish? Washer, that may also. Yeah, if you say flying saucer, then that's probably your right hemisphere. High quality, yeah? Ah, great. Great. So that's coming from the memory of those Archie comics. Yeah, and another difference between the two hemispheres would be while reading a sentence, it's the left hemisphere that predicts how it's going to end. So even as I'm speaking, you kind of know what the next word is going to be and how the sentence will end. That's your left hemisphere. But the right hemisphere has a different approach. It doesn't predict. It sits back and maybe it's waiting to see how you're going to end it. So therefore, perhaps it's open to unexpected endings of sentences. Another interesting thing about these two readers is that people with Alzheimer's disease, patients of Alzheimer's, they first lose their literal meaning making. They retain figurative meaning making for a lot longer before even that begins to be lost. And the last interesting possibility that both of us will talk about is, do we all lie along two continuums? One is the decoding continuum, as he said, that is where we either have stronger or weaker skills at fluency of just decoding. And the other continuum is the comprehension. It's a different thing, and we may have, again, better or weaker comprehension skills, reading between the lines and so on. Both of these need to grow and develop side by side, and merely teaching reading as decoding is simply not enough. We were talking about how children with autism are an interesting case in point here, because we've heard and we understand that for these children, they can be hyperlexical. They are extremely good at decoding, but they find comprehension very, very difficult. And especially, I would imagine, this reading between the lines is very difficult for them. So we were talking about how comprehension relies so heavily on social and emotional experiences, right?
Yes. So the social, and we also practice that in IB schools. We talk about constructivism and we talk about learning being a social act. It's the same thing for reading, that we often rely on the experience of other people to help us comprehend reading actually better. So it's that social bond with other people that helps us also get to being better readers. And so if you look at it, it's this experience of the world that is helping us actually read better. And now something interesting happens. Once we also have the experience of the world and we're able to talk to people, it helps us read better. Reading itself is going to now build our knowledge of the world. Now you see, it's the other way around. Reading itself is going to build your knowledge of the world. And how? And this is where all the talks you've been hearing and the panels you've been hearing about, you see, being sympathetic, connecting with the lives of other people. Because when you read, you live vicariously, which means you live in place of the other person across time and across space. So we can't obviously develop direct experience of the world all the time, and that's where we rely on reading. But we do need some knowledge of the world to help to kickstart that and get us going with reading, and then sympathetically we can transport ourselves into other people's experiences and develop, via that, we are now developing a greater knowledge of the world. And so more experience outside, more reading helps you read better, and you develop greater knowledge of the world. At this stage, I want to propose something else because of that. And if it's experience, then we may want to think very differently about age categories. Do we want to say then that it's experience specific rather than age specific, rather than saying a 6-year-old reader versus a reader with this much experience is expected to be able to read and comprehend this much? Of course, you can do this. You can say that I expect this much experience of the world from a 6-year-old. But what are we doing to develop that experience of the world that will help them read better? So it's a bit tricky there, and I want to propose something else which might be a little controversial, and that is the literal meaning of the word reading versus the figurative meaning of the word reading. We often say, that we read a picture book, but that would be the metaphorical use of the word reading. The literal meaning of the word reading, if we want to use it literally, you can use both, no harm, but just to distinguish it clearly in our minds, is that when you read language, now when the word language becomes metaphorical and literal, and by language now we mean things like English, Hindi, French, so on and so forth. What does that mean? Why do I say that reading or looking at a picture book is not the same as reading something written in language? And that comes from an interesting concept in linguistics called duality of patterning, which is the only thing that human beings can do with language which they can't do with other visual objects. And that is, when you see a visual object on a page, it already has meaning. It's full of meaning. But you see a word, when you're listening to me, take the word word, the way I said it, it consists of 3 sounds. Those sounds are absolutely meaningless. There's a w sound, there's an sound, there's a d sound. On their own, they have no meaning. And every language has a limited number of these sounds. English has approximately 44. I think Hindi has about 50 odd, a little more than. That's an inventory of sounds. And that's one meaningless level. And that's the decoding as well. We see these meaningless things, and we're able to combine them. When a writer writes, we can combine them in an almost infinite number of ways to make meaningful things. And that's what language does. Whereas when we see something that's a picture, it already has meaning. I'm not working from the meaningless to the meaningful. And that's called, as best as I can express it, duality of patterning. And so the thing that we can perhaps take away from this is the point that I'd like to reiterate, is that to think of reading as experience-specific. Rich experience, a rich reader. And how do I make a rich reader? Experience of the world and more reading. So that's what I'd like to say.
I have a 10-year-old nephew, and I remember, must have been a couple of years back, he said something to which I said, "Look who's talking." And he just said his name. So, and the other example I remember, there's a very nice book called What Do You Do With an Idea? It's a whole series. And I made him read it because I really liked the book. And at the end he read it, and then at the end he said, "But Parul Masi, what do you do with an idea?" Because the book is quite abstract. So like when you talked about that there is the figurative aspect of reading and the literal aspect of reading, I wonder, like, does the science also say that, say, getting the figurative or the abstract happens only at a certain age, or?
Sorry, I don't know the research about the developmental pattern of these two. But I would imagine it has to go hand in hand, because you see, you don't have to know how to read, because you can listen to language and still access both literal and figurative meanings, which is what your nephew did. He heard you say, look who's talking. So I don't think it has to wait for reading. It's part of rich language. So my guess, I don't know, but my guess is it can go together.
When you spoke about, yeah, I think, when you spoke about the controversial bit of saying that the experiences come from life or is it from reading, so I have a student in my class who loves reading so much so that his mom is concerned about his social well-being, and he knows a lot. You can have an adult conversation in the sense of when you question him, which we do a lot in the inquiry, it all comes, he may not have experienced it, but because he's read so much, his information and what he knows, his all the context comes from his reading. So I'm on the fence about,
Yeah.
I feel that it comes, reading does help a lot. And my brother is also an example. He quit education after grade 10 and he's completely self-taught now. He's a designer and he's a developer and he's a writer and he's all sorts of things, and he relied completely on reading. So that's why I was a little, to what you said, that was a very interesting statement. So thank you for that. That's really interesting.
And thank you for that. No, maybe I should clarify here that, of course, reading itself does lead to us increasing our knowledge of the world. But that initial part where we move beyond decoding and referencing objects and then more and more abstract things and abstract ideas will still have to be referenced to something in the real world. And then we can take it off, and what we read, we continue to develop. Because reading does have that advantage. We live many lives at once and from our fixed places. And that's exactly what's being experienced there. That I don't know what it's like to live, like someone in Africa or in America, or forget that, maybe 700 years ago. But when I read, I'm able to put myself there and experience life through such things. That's what I'm saying.